In this chapter, we will be discussing muscle and muscle tissue. The large majority of the chapter is on skeletal muscle, and then at the end of the chapter, we're going to discuss smooth muscle. So, first of all, we need to compare the three different types of muscles that we have in our body. The first is skeletal muscle, and skeletal muscle is packaged in into the muscles themselves, the skeletal muscle tissue, and those are organs that are attached to the bone as well as the skin. Skeletal muscle fibers are the longest of muscles, and they have striations, which are stripes in the muscle that we can see under the microscope. Skeletal muscle is voluntary, which means it's consciously controlled, and we have to make a decision to actually contract it. The other two types are not consciously controlled, so they are what we call involuntary. Cardiac muscle tissue is only found in the heart, makes up the bulk of the heart walls. It does have striations, the stripes, like skeletal, but again, it's involuntarily controlled. So it cannot be controlled consciously. The last is smooth muscle, and smooth muscle tissue is found in the walls of hollow organs. It's also found in the gastrointestinal system, as well as the walls of blood vessels. So some examples would be in the wall of the stomach, the urinary bladder, and the airways. So we can add the urinary system here, as well as the respiratory system. So, for example, the bronchioles have smooth muscle in their walls. Smooth muscle is the only one of the three that is not striated. And again, it's involuntarily controlled, so it cannot be consciously controlled. The characteristics and functions of muscle tissue are shown on this slide. There are four major characteristics that muscles share. The first of which is excitability or responsiveness. And that's the ability to receive and respond to a stimuli. Another way to characterize this is using the term irritability because they're kind of irritated or stimulated by a stimulus and they respond to that. The next characteristic is contractility, and this is the ability to shorten forcibly when stimulated. And in this chapter, we're going to learn that there are specific proteins that form what are called cross bridges, and we'll learn the mechanism by which that happens. The third characteristic is extensibility, the ability to stretch. And lastly, we have elasticity, which is the ability to recoil to that resting length. The four important functions are to produce movement. That movement could be locomotion and manipulation of the environment, and that would be skeletal muscle. Walking would be skeletal muscle, but digestion and pumping blood would be the smooth muscle for digestion, and pumping blood would be in the heart, would be cardiac muscle, but in the blood vessels, it would be smooth muscle. The next function is maintaining posture and body position, stabilization of joints, and generating heat as they contract. So this would be an example of shivering to generate heat. When we look at skeletal muscle anatomy, we have the organ itself is made up of different tissues. Remember, that's the definition of an organ, is two or more different tissues. And the three features are nerves and blood supply, connective tissue, as well as attachments to bones. So each muscle receives a nerve, artery, and a vein. They're consciously controlled. So they have a nerve fiber that's controlling that activity, as we'll be learning about in this chapter. The contracting muscle fibers require huge amounts of oxygen and nutrients. So, one topic that we're going to talk about in this chapter is metabolism to produce that oxygen. And they also need waste products to be removed quickly. Each skeletal muscle fiber is covered by a connective tissue, and those connective tissue layers are called the epimysium, which is surrounding the entire muscle, the perimysium, which is surrounding what's called a fascicle, and that is a group of muscle fibers. And then finally, an endomysium, which is surrounding each muscle fiber. And we'll see those on this slide. We have a great micrograph on the right, which shows the three different connective tissue layers. So surrounding the entire muscle is the epimysium. The perimysium is what is surrounding a fascicle, which is a group of muscle fibers. And then the endomysium would be surrounding an individual muscle fiber. Also, when you look at um, a steak, for example, and you look at what's called the marbling of the steak, that marbling is caused because of these different membranes, which is pretty amazing. When we look at the illustration connecting the skeletal muscle to the bone, we first can see the tendon is what is going to attach the skeletal muscle to the bone or anchor it. Then the epimysium is around the entire muscle, as you can see here. We then have a perimysium wrapping around a fascicle, and within that fascicle are large groups of muscle fibers. So this group right here, for example, is a group of muscle fibers called a fascicle. And the endomysium is then found in between muscle fibers. So this is one individual muscle fiber shown here at the bottom. The attachment sites for skeletal muscles, like the tendon, those attachment sites are going to span joints and also attach to bones. We have two different types of attachments. We have one that's called an insertion, and that's the attachment to the movable bone, or and it's usually oftentimes more distal when we refer to the limbs. Whereas the insertion is the attachment to the immovable or less movable bone, and it is going to be more proximal. And we can actually see the names a lot of times within the name of the muscle for the origin and the insertion. So if we consider the name of this muscle, which you'll be learning about in the next chapter, the cleido is referring to the clavicle, and that is the origin of the muscle. Whereas this is referring to the mastoid process, and this is the insertion of the muscle. So these attachment sites, some of them are direct or what we call fleshy, where the epimysium is fused to the periosteum of the bone, whereas some are what are called indirect, where the connective tissue wrappings extend beyond the muscle as kind of a rope-like tendon, or what's called an aponeurosis. And an aponeurosis is what's called a flat tendon. And one example of this is on the top of your head, called the glia aponeurotica.